The rain was relentless that night, then needles of water slicing down from a black sky, soaking her hair, her clothes, her skin. Alina stood on the front porch, bare feet on cold stone, as the door shut with a quiet click behind her. No yelling, no theatrics. Just Margot's smug face flickering behind the frosted glass and the deadbolt turning like punctuation at the end of a sentence. The silence afterward was deafening. Her mother had said nothing. Her sister had watched without blinking. Alina didn't knock. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply turned, stepped off the porch, and vanished into the rain. Soaked but unshattered. The world would believe Margot's version. They always had. Perfect Margot, the golden girl, with pearly teeth and social grace, spinning her web with kind words and counterfeit concern. Alina had spent years wondering what she'd done wrong, but that night, in the wet quiet of the city bus shelter, something clicked. It wasn't heartbreak, she felt it was precision. Cold, sharp clarity. She didn't want to go back. She wanted to make sure Margot never stood that tall again. In the weeks that followed, Alina didn't sleep much. She didn't need to. Her mind became sharper without the fog of grief. She moved through cheap hostels and bus stations like a ghost, but not aimless. She replayed every moment how Margot had positioned herself as the family's savior, how she'd always known just what lie to tell, how she'd planted doubts in others before Alina even opened her mouth to speak. This wasn't impulsive jealousy. This was architecture. Margot had been planning her rise for years, and Alina's erasure had been built into the foundation. It wasn't just the family that had turned. Friends she'd known since childhood now crossed streets to avoid her. Former mentors gave tight-lipped condolences, not eye contact. Alina studied them, their reactions, their loyalties, and began mapping the structure. Margot had built a perfect tower of influence, made from polite deceptions and sacrificial truths. It was impressive, even admirable. But every tower has a flaw, and Alina was patient enough to find it. She began to test the weight of memories. A conversation from 2 years ago, a birthday party where Margot had slipped away during dessert, a photograph where the shadows didn't quite match the smiles. Slowly, pieces began to click. Margot hadn't just outshone her, she had maneuvered her into isolation. Jobs Alina was passed over for. Opportunities that vanished before they began. The pattern was unmistakable. Margot had turned their own parents into gatekeepers of her power. She hadn't pushed Alina down the stairs, she'd just made sure no one would catch her if she fell. Alina returned to the city quietly, not announcing herself. She took a part-time job at a bookstore 3 blocks from their old neighborhood, wearing glasses she didn't need and a name tag that read Celia. She watched from the shadows as Margot flourished charity galas, corporate promotions, the same public poise that had once impressed even Alina. But now, it looked different. It looked brittle. Behind the practiced laugh and the perfect posture, Alina began to spot the tension, a twitch of the hand, a pause too long between pleasantries. She began sending anonymous tips. Small things, carefully worded. An internal audit request at Margot's company. A suggestion to a gossip columnist about someone who'd risen too quickly. A perfectly timed message to a former friend of Margot's, with screenshots and no return address. She wasn't trying to destroy Margot overnight. She was poking the picking structure to see which parts creaked first. Margot never noticed the rot setting in. She mistook the nervous glances at meetings for admiration, not suspicion. She didn't realize her assistant had stopped trusting her, that her boyfriend was reading texts he hadn't been meant to see. Alina watched the cracks widen. She didn't force them, she simply watered them, and when the time came, Alina opened the first real door. A whistleblower email crafted with exact language from Margot's own deleted messages. Ones Alina had recovered with quiet help from a contact at a telecom company. The messages revealed backdoor deals, cover-ups, and carefully concealed betrayals. It was sent to a board member, an investor, and a rival exec, enough people that Margot would never find the source. When the news broke, Margot's face was on every screen, her polished smile replaced with press conference panic and legal jargon. But that was only Act 1. Alina wasn't done. She released the second wave weeks later, photos of Margot with a married senator. Bank transactions to offshore accounts, all anonymously verified. Suddenly, the story wasn't about ethics, it was about corruption, scandal. Margot was no longer a victim of misinformation. She was a story no one wanted to be seen defending. Margot tried to retaliate. She hired a PR firm, reached out to old allies, and even began sniffing around her past, searching for shadows. But she was too late. The people she once manipulated now saw through the veil. Her desperation made her sloppy. And Alina, always 2 steps ahead, ensured every attempt at damage control only made her look guiltier. Margot's boyfriend left first quietly, then the investors pulled out. Then came the layoffs, the lawsuit, the resignation she delivered with trembling hands and a camera pointed at her face. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. She looked nothing like the woman who had once locked her sister out into the rain. And through it all, Alina said nothing. She didn't post. She didn't show up. She didn't even whisper her name. She simply watched her sister's empire burn down without lifting a finger in public. When it was done, when Margot had lost the company, the credibility, and the curated world she'd built, Alina passed her on the street. Margot didn't recognize her. Her eyes were hollow, skin pale with the look of someone who hadn't slept in days. She looked straight at her sister and saw a stranger. Alina kept walking. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She had nothing to prove. The past didn't need to be rewritten. It had been replaced by silence, by strategy, by a story only one person would ever know. And that was enough. The first time Alina met Margot, she mistook her for elegance. The woman had a smile so perfect it seemed carved, her voice smooth like silk over steel. When Jason introduced them, his eyes sparkled with admiration. And Alina, young, hopeful, and in love, saw only warmth in Margot's words. She didn't realize until much later that the warmth was a slow burn, carefully calibrated to melt her edges without her noticing. The wedding was beautiful. Every detail pristine. Every guest handpicked by Margot. Even the vows had been edited lightly. Of course, for rhythm, she had said. And Alina had agreed, because why not? Everything Margot did seemed thoughtful, generous, sophisticated. But beneath the silk and gold, something cold pulsed just beneath the surface. Jason hadn't seen it. Or perhaps he had and chose to look away. Alina told herself she was imagining it. Until she realized the smile Margot wore when she handed her the keys to their shared home wasn't kindness. It was control. At first, it was in the little things. Margot sent a monthly cleaner to help Alina keep up. She'd drop off gourmet groceries that Alina probably didn't know how to cook and gently suggest new friends, new places, new habits. It all looked generous, so no one questioned it, but each gift came with a string, one that looped around Alina's choices. A gallery opening Margot insisted she attend instead of her own job interview. A dinner party where Alina's seat kept being moved farther from Jason's. It felt petty, until it wasn. Soon, Alina began missing pieces of herself. Margot had somehow become her emergency contact, not Jason. Her emails rerouted through Margot's shared planner. Her voice in decisions about furniture, finances, even family began to disappear. Jason brushed it off with half smiles. Margot's just helping. But the help never ended, and the house began to feel more like a museum of someone else's life. Alina's paintings were moved into storage. Her books replaced with sleek coffee table decor. She still lived there, but only by name. Then came the money. A new joint account for transparency. Her freelance work rerouted for simplicity. Jason called it adulting. Alina called it a trap. Every purchase was questioned. Every misstep magnified. Maybe don't buy those shoes, Margot would say with a laugh. Jason prefers a more polished look. It always sounded like advice. It always felt like an order. The love Alina once felt began to feel like surveillance dressed as affection. But the worst part wasn't Margot. It was watching Jason change. He no longer looked at her the way he used to. When she laughed, he didn't join in, he corrected. When she spoke, he didn't listen, he deferred. Margot had become the voice in his head, the filter through which he saw everything Alina did. One night, Alina overheard them whispering in the kitchen. Her name was spoken like a problem, not a partner. She's fragile, Margot said, as though diagnosing a flaw. Jason didn't disagree. Soon, accusations began to surface. A broken vase she hadn't touched, an email she'd supposedly deleted. Margot always found them first. I just thought you should know, she'd say, holding up the proof. Jason began looking at Alina like she was someone he didn't recognize, and maybe, to him, she was. Margot had replaced her piece by piece. Not by force, but by suggestion. Alina wasn't being pushed out, she was being erased. And then, one day, the door didn't open. Jason had taken a sudden business trip. Margot stayed behind, smiling too calmly. There's been a misunderstanding, she said, slipping an envelope into Alina's hand. It contained a single sheet of paper, a false confession, typed in neat paragraphs, admitting to financial misconduct. Alina stared at it, unable to breathe. Her bank access was gone. Her name removed from the lease. Every legal thread unspooled without her knowing. She tried the front door again. It didn't budge. Margot tilted her head. "Jason needs time," she said. "You've made things ... difficult." There was no anger in her tone, just satisfaction. Alina stood in the hallway, holding nothing but that letter. And for a moment, she thought she'd break. That was what Margot wanted. To snap her clean in two and discard the pieces like confetti. But Alina didn't cry. She didn't shout. She walked away one step at a time, hands empty, but spine unbent. What Margot didn't realize was that the woman she'd cast out was no longer asking for a place at the table. She was building her own. That night, soaked in rain and silence, Alina didn't collapse. She began to calculate. Margot had won the surface game. She'd taken the house, the husband, the finances. But she hadn't touched what mattered: Alina's memory, her mind, her war. And in those three things, a plan began to grow. Alina knew where the cracks were. She'd lived inside the machine Margot built. She knew the passwords, the schedules, the lies wrapped in silk. For weeks, she said nothing. She simply gathered emails, call logs, transaction history. Margot had been careful, but not invincible. And Jason, for all his newfound distance, had habits, weak spots, blind loyalty. Alina fed the pieces to a fire that no one saw coming. She sent a carefully worded message to Jason's company's ethics board. Not from her own name. Not all at once. Margot's funneling of funds through Jason's name was subtle, but traceable if you knew where to look. And Alina knew. Margot's network began to shift beneath her feet. Jason's promotions stalled. Meetings were canceled. Clients walked away. And still, Margot smiled, oblivious to the rot eating her empire from within. Alina never needed to confront her. That would have been too loud. She wanted Margot to feel it slowly, to realize too late that the world she had so tightly choreographed was no longer obeying her steps. By the time the investigations started, by the time Jason was suspended pending review, by the time the news quietly spread about the shell accounts and legal breaches, Margot finally saw the edge of the cliff. She'd been walking blindfolded. And then she looked for Alina, but there was no return address, no trail, just absence. The house still stood, but inside it, echoes replaced laughter. Alina never looked back. Her silence was her victory. Her memory was the map. Her war was already won. And Margot, she was left with her trophies, her empty rooms, and the cold realization that the woman she tried to destroy didn't just survive. She rewrote the ending. The room smelled faintly of cedar and dust. A forgotten corner in a friend's countryside guest house where no one asked questions and nothing reminded her of who she used to be. It was quiet, here too quiet for some, but for Alina, the silence became a whetstone. She didn't cry, didn't unravel. She studied. With a second-hand laptop and a cheap prepaid phone, she began tracing threads. Not out of desperation, out of focus. Vengeance didn't come from fury. It came from clarity. She began with the digital. Breadcrumbs, half-deleted emails, payment notifications that didn't add up, and text threads where Margot's influence left faint fingerprints. There were forwarded job applications Alina never sent, responses that were never delivered. Messages between Margot and Jason that reeked of setup, written in cold implication instead of outright accusation. They hadn't been sloppy, they'd been calculated. But no one covers everything. The more Alina dug, the more she found seams. Her credit score had been tampered with. Her business name was registered by someone else, and the photos, screenshots Margot had taken during innocuous moments now painted Alina as unstable, erratic, volatile. The deception wasn't recent. It had been years in the making. The memories came, without warning, but this time, they weren't shackles. They were blueprints. The night Jason asked her to cancel a client dinner, "You know Margot already planned something, don't be difficult." The time she'd cried after being accused of losing bank papers, only to find them months later in Margot's handwriting. The day she was told she was overreacting for calling out how her words were twisted in front of family. Alina relived, each one now, not with pain, but with precision. These weren't just traumas. They were timestamps. Margot hadn't just tried to destroy her. She'd written a role for Alina to play, fragile, forgettable, frustrating. And when Alina refused to perform, she was cut out. The realization wasn't a surprise. It was a mirror. Margot had always been this cold, only now Alina had stopped mistaking the chill for charm. And with that, she stopped mourning. She started calculating. She taught herself contract law. Not through university, but through open access legal forums, downloadable PDFs, and case files buried in online court databases. She memorized clauses about financial fraud, digital impersonation, and property transfer under false pretense. She learned about whistleblower protections, forensic data recovery, and chain of custody protocols. While Margot sipped cocktails under filtered skylights, Alina built an arsenal of facts, of legislation, of truths no longer deniable. And then came the introductions. A women's legal aid group welcomed her without hesitation, not as a victim, but as a strategist. One contact led to another. A digital forensics analyst offered help, intrigued by the pattern Alina had charted out. A nonprofit that assisted survivors of coercive control took interest in her story, not as a case study, but as a partner. Alina didn't ask for pity. She requested policy. She didn't dwell on pain. She built a paper trail. It began small, an anonymous inquiry to Margot's employer regarding compliance violations. A tip submitted to a financial ethics board about Jason's past account irregularities, using language only someone inside the network would know. Then came a letter unsigned, untraceable, containing copies of property documents with forged initials. Each piece was planted with surgical precision. Each domino carefully placed. Margot didn't feel the shift at first. She continued gliding through her curated life, confident that the past had been scrubbed, but policies were triggered. Internal reviews launched. A meeting was called behind closed doors. Colleagues began whispering, questions surfacing in hallways Margot once commanded. Still, Alina waited. She had one final layer. The forged loan approval Jason had taken on Margot's behalf, filed under a name that no longer had access to her own accounts. The fake invoice trail Margot used to launder consulting fees back into her personal investments, and the real punch, an encrypted folder recovered from a long-forgotten shared drive, where Margot had backed up texts meant to destroy Alina's credibility, now turned into proof of premeditated defamation. Alina sat in that same room and smiled, not because it was over, but because it was beginning. The truth wasn't just hers anymore. It had dates. It had witnesses. It had weight. And Margot, for all her plotting, never saw it coming. Because the only thing more dangerous than a woman erased is the woman who remembers everything. Margot believed she had one. The paperwork had been signed, the assets shifted, and her world remained polished and intact. What she didn't notice, what her arrogance refused to see, was that in bypassing a mandatory disclosure clause during her latest real estate transfer, she'd done something sloppy, something illegal. And this time, someone was watching. Alina had spent months in silence, studying Margot's methods, memorizing the rhythms of her deception. But this was the first real misstep. The transfer document had a signature dated 3 days before Alina had even received the proposal. It wasn't just a forgery, it was careless. The kind of mistake that only happened when someone felt too untouchable to check twice. Alina didn't react. She documented. She traced the bribe to the registrar's assistant, a deposit made from a shell company connected to Margot's silent holdings. The lie Margot had told publicly about funding a women's shelter turned out to be a front for laundering personal tax write-offs. Each piece now belonged to Alina, folded neatly into her archive of revenge. The power shifted the moment Alina stopped collecting and began releasing. A whistleblower report here. A subtle correction sent to a journalist there. A discrepancy raised with the city's land management office. She knew exactly which dominoes would fall first and how they would echo, and she never signed a name. Every document arrived unsigned. Every tip untraceable. She didn't need credit, she needed cracks. And cracks began to form. The news hit quietly. An online article questioning donor transparency. A compliance audit, triggered by a single anonymous submission. Margot's name wasn't at the center yet, but the silence around her started humming. An envelope arrived at the ethics board with internal invoices and a forged board approval. A copy went to the lead anchor of a network Margot once bragged about funding. The damage didn't roar, it whispered. And that made it impossible to stop. Jason, always loyal, always blind, started to notice timelines that no longer aligned. Bank transfers that predated authorization. Legal approvals signed by people who no longer worked at the firm. He asked his mother about them once, casually, and the flicker in her eyes betrayed more than words could. She lied anyway. But now, he listened differently. The silence around Margot began to unravel. A housekeeper fired years ago for theft reached out through a forum where Alina had planted breadcrumbs. The woman had stories, conversations, dates, names. A long-dismissed accountant re-emerged, with digital backups of ledgers Margot had claimed were lost in a system crash. They weren't victims anymore. They were witnesses. Margot tried to stay poised. She even hosted a gala the weekend after the first expos aired. But beneath the charm, her hands trembled. Her voice cracked. She made calls in the middle of the night, had emails deleted from servers, froze accounts, but nothing stopped the spiral. The more she tried to hide, the more it proved there was something worth hiding. Her panic betrayed her. In an emergency board meeting, she lashed out at an auditor. At home, she screamed at Jason for asking too many questions. Her walls were glass now, and everyone could see her unravel. What once looked like control, now looked like fear. She suspected Alina, but couldn't prove it, couldn't find a trace. And that was the brilliance of it. Alina hadn't left fingerprints, only footprints leading exactly where she wanted them to go down. Now everything was in place. The files were categorized, the witnesses protected, the legal filings timed with strategic leaks. The first domino sat on her desk, still untouched, waiting. She didn't need to knock it over herself. She only needed to let gravity do the work. They said the truth would set you free. What they never said was how quietly it could destroy someone. The first whispers didn't come from Alina. They came from a leaked contract, an unsigned email, a deleted spreadsheet suddenly restored. Margot's name, once spoken with admiration, now lingered like a warning in corporate corridors and late-night news segments. Her smile, her image, her flawless reputation, none of it could stop the wildfire once it began. She wanted a war, and she made herself the battlefield. But Alina didn't send soldiers. She handed her a mirror. There were no angry posts, no dramatic press releases, just a single video, quiet, polished. Alina sitting in a plain chair, no title beneath her name, no accusations in her voice. She never said Margot's name. She didn't need to. She spoke in timelines, in numbers, in confirmed wire transfers and board meeting minutes. Every fact was cross-referenced, time-stamped, and clear. The internet didn't scroll past it, they paused. They saw a woman who had no need to scream, because what she held was truth, and truth doesn't scream. It echoes. By the time Margot tried to control the narrative, the damage had already woven itself into the public's memory. Alina didn't respond to her denials, didn't chase headlines. She let the silence expand. She knew silence was heavier than any statement. It held weight. It made people lean in, and the more Margot spoke, the more the world listened to the woman who said nothing. No tears, no outrage, just facts. The truth didn't need emotion. It needed space. The headlines stopped using words like alleged and claims. Now, they said fraud, indictment, evidence. Courtrooms filled with accountants and executives who had once shaken Margot's hand, now testifying under oath. Her assets were frozen. Her charities investigated. Contracts dissolved. Overnight, a brand once built on elegance and empowerment now collapsed under the weight of unpaid interns, silenced victims, and offshore accounts. Jason finally saw it. Not in a single moment, but in fragments, bank records he'd dismissed, memories he'd doubted. His voice cracked the day he called Alina, trying to apologize. He said he hadn't known. Said he was sorry. But regret isn't currency. It doesn't buy back trust. Alina answered with the same calm she'd always had. I know you didn't know. That was the problem. And then she ended the call, because some doors, once closed, don't reopen. Margot tried to spin it as betrayal, as jealousy, as a vendetta. But every article, every hearing, every audit pointed back to her own decisions. Alina hadn't forged documents. Alina hadn't bribed anyone. She hadn't whispered lies in Margot's ear or pushed her to cut corners. All she had done was hold up a mirror and step aside. Margot dug her own grave. Alina simply let her look at it. The irony was sharp once erased from her own company. Alina now advised others how to protect their names, their rights, their power. She didn't broadcast her work. She didn't need a spotlight. Her name was passed quietly, confidently, among women who'd been told to stay small. She taught them precision. Taught them how to build without noise. How to never give their enemies something to twist. She never gave a final speech. Never offered Margot a last word or an audience for her unraveling. Alina understood what real power sounded like. It didn't shout. It moved in strategy, in silence, in precision. When she walked away, it wasn't a victory lap. It was peace, and sometimes, peace is the loudest ending of all. It ended the same way it began, in silence. Not the comfortable kind that comes with peace, but the hollow stillness of something stripped bare. Margot sat alone in the house that once hosted power lunches and fundraisers. Her name still etched in the frosted glass door, though it no longer meant anything. The world no longer called. Her reflection in the polished marble no longer looked like a leader. It looked like a remnant. The fallout had cleared, but the silence lingered, unforgiving and final. This wasn't a fall from grace. This was exiles served without a trial, without a scene, just facts, consequences, and quiet. The company name was still registered, but the accounts had been frozen. Lawsuits had drained the reserves faster than years of mismanagement ever could. Former allies had gone quiet. Publicly, they had said nothing, but they didn't return her calls either. Her board had vanished like fog in sunlight, loyal only, until loyalty became liability. The empire she built had no legacy, now only dust. And as the dust settled, all she had left were memories of applause, of admiration, of Jason saying he was proud. Even that had turned to ash. He tried, once, to make sense of it. Jason had always believed his mother was hard, but fair. Ruthless, but brilliant. Until the facts came in cold, time-stamped, undeniable. Alina hadn't needed to smear her. The truth had done that on its own. Jason saw it all in the files. Emails, ledger entries, lies. And suddenly, every time his mother had dismissed Alina's concerns echoed back, this time with weight. He didn't try to defend her, he couldn't. But shame doesn't erase complicity. He apologized in private. Once it wasn't enough. Alina hadn't been waiting for one. What she built next wasn't meant to be a monument to revenge. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't made of bitterness. It was clean, honest, solid. A legal consulting firm focused on protecting women in startups. Small, efficient, but impossible to overlook. She hired with care, mentored with patience. She didn't burn bridges, she replaced them with better ones. No gloating, just growth. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. She simply existed, stronger. What had once been a scar was now her sharpest tool. Alina never called herself a survivor. She called herself a strategist. She didn't just move on, she taught others how to win in silence. How to document without reacting, how to prepare instead of retaliate. She spoke at closed-door panels. She created a podcast that never used names, but every story felt like hers until it became theirs too. The pain became purpose, and the purpose became power. Not power for herself, but for others to reclaim what had been stolen from them. It had been nearly a year when she walked past Margot's house again. Not intentionally, not dramatically, just a walk through an old neighborhood. She saw the blinds flutter, the shape of a woman who used to terrify boardrooms now trapped by the weight of her own legend. Alina didn't stop. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Presence alone was enough. That one step forward, taken without hesitation, was louder than any revenge speech. Behind the window, Margot didn't move. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't shout, because she knew. No scandal had broken her. No enemy had outplayed her. She had done this to herself. And now, the woman who once stood silent beneath her thumb walked taller than ever, unbothered, unreachable. Margot was no longer a threat. She was just a warning. There would be no reunion. No dramatic confrontation. Alina would never be at her doorstep again, never in her inbox. She had been erased from Margot's world, but Margot had been replaced in hers. Alina had rebuilt a life so full, so rooted in peace and principle, that no apology or explanation could gain entry. It wasn't exclusion out of spite. It was a boundary built from healing. In the end, Alina didn't need revenge. She didn't need a reckoning or a headline. She just needed truth, peace, and the freedom to begin again. And she had all three. That was the ending Margot never saw coming, and the one Alina always deserved.